Well, Professor Phil Moriarty, thank you very much for coming to join us today. We're going to be chatting about peer review, and in particular the topic of transparency in peer review, which is the main theme of this year's Peer Review Week. But I want to start with quite a broad question about peer review in general. In your opinion, is the peer review process in its current form good for science, or would you rather see a different approach to assessing scientific research?
So the broad principle of peer review, I think, is important and I think is advantageous. Just at the level of you take your paper, you send it out to other people to take a look at and to review and to provide their expertise. And, you know, sometimes it's shot down in flames, but often even when it is shot down in flames, after you take that little bit of time to stand back and go, bloody referee, you generally realise that they have a point. Not always, but most times. So at that level, in terms of getting feedback on your work, opening it up to criticism before it's published, that is good. And it's got to be there in terms of some level of quality control. It's really in terms of the fine detail that I think we need to tune.
And so, well, moving on more now to the fine detail of peer review and the different models of peer review that we could embrace as an industry or as a scientific community, let's talk about open peer review, which of course means different things to different people depending on whom you ask. But in this case, particularly identity, where authors and reviewers know the identity of the other party during the review process. Do you think that this is a positive way of conducting peer review?
So that's a great question. It's a very, very broad question that we could spend 2 hours on. The question of anonymity is a very multifaceted one and is problematic from many different views. So in principle, you know, historically here, that's how peer reviewers worked with anonymous reviewers. And in principle, that's a good thing in terms of making for perhaps slightly more critical reviews. Because if you know somebody and you know that your review is going to them, just the psychology of it all is very, very different if you're anonymous and you compared to not anonymous. My concern is when we move towards online review. And in particular, I've had a number of discussions, a number of debates with PubPeer, which is a site whereby any paper which has a digital object identifier can be uploaded to that site and critiqued. And that's great. I actually think that's where we need to go. And PubPeer should be lauded because they were one of the first to do this. And they've been very important, in particularly in some cases, in taking fraudulent work down and critiquing it. The problem is with the two sides of the anonymity issue. If you've got a PhD student, for example, that sees issues with a paper published by leaders in the field, it would be asking a lot for them to critique that paper openly and to put their name to the critique because, you know, ultimately they might be looking for a job in that group. That's one end. The problem is, if you are anonymous, particularly if you're anonymous online and your review is public, all it takes is for a disgruntled postdoc or a disgruntled other researcher or somebody with an axe to grind to really, you know, compromise the peer review process dramatically.
Do you think that the quality of reports that are derived from these sort of open online forums, is it better or worse than what you would have from the more traditional single-blind peer review?
So, let's focus on the single-blind peer review. What I find really intriguing about the single-blind peer review is that the quality of the report very often, almost invariably, scales with the perceived prestige of the journal. So if we submit something in one of the, let's name names, one of the Nature family of journals, the report that you get back tends to be a heck of a lot detailed than the report you'll get back if you submit to another journal, or a different type of journal, which is intriguing. So it's almost that like I hate the impact factor idea, but I know an awful lot of academics place stock in the impact factor, which I really wish they wouldn't. But it is almost like that drives a cycle whereby the prestige of the journal is linked into that impact factor, which drives the prestige, etc., etc. And so there seems to be, for the blind peer review, there does seem to be a link to the journal quality. So, for example, we've had reviews which have been incredibly detailed and have, definitely improved the quality of the paper. However, I've also seen reviews online at that level. Often with a sort of unregistered or anonymous commentator that have really gone into the minutiae of a particular paper, particularly anything Western blot related. It just seems to me that there's an awful lot of dodgy science out there circulating around Western blots. An awful lot of pub peers about looking at Western blot images, and they do the reviewers, the online reviewers, do remarkable levels of image analysis where they'll zoom in and go, oh, well, this particular part of the Western blot, well, what's happened here is they've rotated it through 90 degrees, then they've high-pass filtered it, then they've low-pass filtered it, then they've done this, and this, and they back it all out, which is a remarkable amount of effort to put in. And the good thing about that is then that's online for everybody to see. Whereas with the blind peer review, in many cases, not all, that just sits on somebody's or in an editor's email inbox or whatever, and sits on the reviewer's hard drive. It would be great to get that information out there. So to finally address your question, it's very difficult to judge. It really depends on the culture that's put in place for online reviewing, and what can happen is that a very good review can sometimes get dragged into the mire by a series of rather vicious comments following it up, which doesn't happen with sort of traditional peer review. And what's really important in the latter is the editor's role and the moderation role. And I think with pub peer, for example, one thing that we've debated and I think is really important is the level of moderation that happens. I think if you've got that anonymous commenting happening, as long as it's moderated, then that's fine.
Well, so let's turn this on its head. So we've talked about the model of single-blind peer review. What about double-blind peer review, which is actually something that we've been trialling at a few of our journals at IOP Publishing, where authors don't know the identity of their reviewers, but also the reviewers don't know the identity of the authors in this case. Do you think that model has any merit?
So I have a colleague in Nottingham who wrote for Physics World last year, maybe the year before, on double-blind review, Penny Gowland. Penny is particularly keen on double-blind in terms of biases and unconscious biases. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Again, it's a principle versus in practice thing. And think in principle, again, I can see the advantages, particularly from the unconscious bias aspect. In practice, I think it's probably likely in many cases that the identity of the author can be guessed, at least, at the very least guessed, just in terms of the publications that are cited in the paper, etc. Again, if that's moderated and we're talking about double-blind review, which we must be in terms of the traditional peer review system, yeah, I honestly think that that's a good thing overall in balance.
So does open peer review naturally follow on from the open access movement? So, if research should be freely accessible to scientists and even the public that funds that science in some cases, should all of the oversight which leads to the publication of that work be accessible on principle as well?
Yes, entirely. I can give you a fully definitive answer to that one. It just seems so archaic that the entire system is set up, when we're all so interconnected and social media, for better or for worse, is out there and connects all of us. It just seems bizarre that we stick to this routine whereby the paper goes out, it's reviewed by just 2 or 3 people, sometimes 1, if the editors can't get hold of the right reviewers. And then even then, the critique and the reviewer might have spent, quite some time, put a lot of effort into writing that review. It just gets buried. And that review sometimes, we've had papers, where the reviews come back, it's been longer than the paper. Literally, and I know other colleagues where that's the case too. It just seems mad not to put that online when it's so easy to put it online, either anonymously or non-anonymously, and let the reviewer make up their mind as to whether it should be anonymous or not.
Right. We talk a lot about reward and recognition for reviewers and the work that they do, but there's also an argument that peer review is a community-driven pursuit. So there's a shared responsibility of researchers to assess the merit of each other's work and to do so on the basis of mutual cooperation rather than simply seeking recognition for the work that they do. So on which do you think that the community, including publishers like us, should place a greater emphasis?
I would argue that the overriding factor driving all the dynamics with regard to scientific publishing is a reward, but it's reward in the context of the prestige of the journal in which the paper is ultimately published. That I honestly think is the brand name of the journal that really dictates so much of the dynamic, in that a journal can have the best possible procedures and processes in terms of peer review, can have the best possible processes and procedures in terms of open access, and indeed may well reward financially, in some cases, its reviewers, perhaps. But what is always going to win out is the perception of the quality of the journal in the minds of the scientific community. And often that means, and it would be hypocritical of me to suggest that we do anything otherwise, or I do anything otherwise in terms of, the group at Nottingham, is you aim for those journals in the top tier, which are recognised to be the top tier journals. Do those journals publish good papers? Yes. Do those journals publish not very good papers? Yes. But what matters is the prestige they've built up over decades and decades. And that's for publishers who don't have that brand name, don't have that cachet. It's extremely difficult, I would say, to get beyond that, because that's always going to be the driver. A really good example in nanoscience is the Beilstein Journal of Nanotechnology, which is entirely open access in that the authors don't have to pay and the readers don't have to pay. So everything's entirely free, because the Beilstein Journal, it's not a business model I think any other publisher could ever use, because the Beilstein Foundation must have massive pockets to be able to fund this, massively deep pockets. But yet we don't publish there. We publish some papers there. But is that our first choice? No. Should it be our first choice? I would say yes. It really should, because it's entirely open access. But if we were to just publish everything in Beilstein Journal of Nanotechnology, when the postdocs, the students in the group, go to find other jobs or try to move up the career ladder, it's going to be of massive detriment to them. And until we fix that problem, I think it doesn't matter how we tweak peer review at the edges, the prestige aspect is always going to win out.
Thank you. In terms of focusing on reward and recognition, though, which is something that publishers think a lot about, is there something that we can do better, regardless of the prestige of the journals within our portfolios? Is there anything that we can do to make the process better for referees?
If we put the financial considerations to one side, and I think all reviewers would like to be paid, but if we put that to one side, one thing, particularly come back to what we discussed earlier about sometimes the quality of reviews can be really good, sometimes the reviews themselves can be longer than the papers. I think it would be good, particularly if it's early career researchers, and our early career researchers often tend to put a lot of effort into the reviews, is to somehow, if those researchers want that recognition, to give them that recognition. So to publish those, and even to take those published reviews and make them part of the citable primary literature. That would be a way I'd really like to see the system going. Again, there are issues in terms of anonymity, etc. But if somebody writes a review and they'd like that review to, contribute to the CV in some way, that might be a good thing to do.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, let's move on now and talk more about the future of peer review. I think we firmly established that peer review is here to stay, but do you think that we do enough about educating the next generation of peer reviewers about their role in ensuring scientific rigour and providing due scrutiny?
We do a hell of a lot better than we used to do. I'll say that, 20 or 30 years ago, I got the first paper you get a review, you get some mentorship within the school, but in terms of ethics in particular, there's a lot more focus on ethics at PhD and even at undergraduate level to a certain amount in terms of scientific method and fraudulent, trying to pick out fraud and trying to work out, is this the best quality science, what could be improved, etc. I think there's a lot more focus on that. Could we do better? Yeah, we could do better. I think It would be good for, again, if we put the stuff online, if we put the reviews online, publishers could then go, well, look, this is a sterling review. This is exactly what, we could even have a set of reviews. These are our gold quality reviews. This is what you should really aim for. And couple that and use case studies to really show that this is how you should write a good review. And of course, perhaps not naming names, the very poor reviews could also be highlighted as well.
What do you think peer review will look like in 20 years' time?
I would hope that at the very least it will be routine to have the reviews published online with the papers. I'd like to then think that editors, publishers would take those reviews, pick out the very best reviews, say this is the gold standard, this is what we're aiming for, try and collate things like that. I would like there to be a culture of online commenting on papers, certainly the provision made, and in many cases it is made, it's not picked up too often, that's the problem. But I'd hope to see a little bit more interaction online, but interaction that is good scientific discussion and not just slinging mud. And for the latter not to happen, particularly online, requires quite a bit of moderation and therefore quite a bit of investment.
So there'll still be publishers in 20 years' time?
Yeah, so I know I have some colleagues, that's an interesting question. I have some colleagues who'd say, well, we've got the archive, why not just use the archive and even have a sort of Reddit type system, Lord forbid, whereby you have thumbs up and thumbs down on papers. I can see why they'd say that, but again, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting at the IOP, etc. Editors bring a lot of value. Publishers do bring a lot of value in terms of not just marketing of the work, but also in terms of the quality of the work in the end. Particularly, I've just don't want to plug, but I've just finished writing at Burke, and it's been the editing process has been absolutely key in terms of how that evolves, and it would be a great shame to move that to remove that for the process from the scientific publishing process, because I think it adds a great deal of value.
That's very good to know. And I think on that note, we can conclude the interview.
Thank you.